All right, good evening. We are going to continue where we left off with the nervous system, talking a little bit about the brain. But before we actually get into the cerebrum and its parts and the cerebellum and its parts and the brainstem and its parts with the diencephalon, I came across an article a few days ago that I saved. So what I'm going to do is share the screen here. Oops, share the screen. And I found this article on dopamine. This is let's see. I'm pretty sure uh, the conversation is the name of it, and I just found it to be really interesting. If you're interested, I'll pull up the website, theconversation.com. If you go into that and then search dopamine, you'll find it starts with basically the little caption there is how they have it under there. But if you just do theconversation.com and dopamine, you'll get this article. But I just found it interesting because it talks a little bit about how this neurotransmitter, how we know that it's good for mood and thrill and excitement, and that they're finding that there are actually different forms of dopamine that the brain is using for things that they didn't really expect it to be. It's like that doesn't sound like a dopamine thing, but they're finding more dopamine use for it. So I think that science is just get better at just overall getting better at understanding some of the minutia of things. But yeah, so if you get a chance to read this article, or if you're interested even, absolutely, and I know my brain loves when I eat food, so my dopamine's probably pretty high right now because I just finished eating and got back here just a few minutes ago. I had a small window of time, and I'm like, I'm going to get some food. So study is probably where most of this was taken from, a Northwestern University study, uh, the dopamine function based on neuron subtype. So um, sometimes when you read things that have studies in it, they get real sciencey, and it makes it hard to understand or follow along. But I thought that this was a basic way of describing this neurotransmitter. So just a good way to keep on this discussion of the nervous system and neurotransmitters and things of that sort. So I wanted to point that out to you. And now I'm going to show you some pictures of the cerebrum, which is the largest part of the brain. Cerebrum anatomy is what I'm searching here. And we're going to look at some images. Get that out of the way. There we go. All right. So this actually shows what I like to describe as the three major parts of the brain. The cerebrum here on top, the cerebellum to the back bottom, and the brainstem. What you can't really see is that fourth part, the diencephalon, which when I discuss, I kind of cap it on top of the brainstem as part of that overall discussion. But the reason you can't see it is because the cerebrum nestles over the top of it, and we really don't even see all of the brainstem here because of how that's positioned. But notice that in this picture, you see the front of the brain, personality, and then a little lower to the front, speech, and then this whole gyrus executing movement. So you decide you want to move and execute well, planning movement, then executing movement into the overall activity of it happening in your body. Let me get these two people in here. All right. So when you look behind that sulcus, you see this is sensation. So you feel your parts of your body on this gyrus, you move the parts of your body on this gyrus, and as you get further forward, again, personality is one of the things here, but behavior, mood, decision making, analytical thought process is all happening in this front portion, and that's why when that 7-foot ramrod for Phineas Gage went through his orbit of his eye and came out the top of his skull, it took out a part of his brain that he otherwise used for his whole young life that involved his mood, his behavior, and his personality. And so it changed who he was. But this part back here that says language area, that's more language comprehension as far as understanding what the verbal communication. You're hearing on this part of your brain, smelling on this part of the brain, seeing on the very back of the brain. And that's kind of a hard concept for some people to grasp, that you're actually seeing the world through your eyes, which are here in front, yet it's happening on the backside of your brain. One of the things that you might notice is that if there's any impact trauma with the back of the skull, a concussive type traumatic impact force, it may disturb vision. And I never really understood that when I was a younger person, like when I'd see the old movies where they take the billy club and knock somebody out and they just be out cold. In the movies, whenever they knock somebody out, they're just permanently out, right? You just never see them involved in the fight again. But so I never really understood until I had a concussion at 12, where I was basically riding my bicycle, and a friend of mine, we were trying to jump our bikes over different things. And there's a parking lot that had, when you go to parking lots, how there's a little cement like barrier that you pull up to. Well, the typical ones are only about, say, maybe a foot tall at the most. Well, this was old school, like from something like in 1940s, and it was more of a 2-foot by 3-foot cement block, because I was on an Air Force base over in the Philippines, and it was probably something from who knows when it was an airfield. Anyway, my buddy goes and he bunny hops his bike over, and I'm like, okay, I can do it too. And as I got my front part over, but as I tried to pop the rest of my bike, the back wheel hit and it threw me off the front of the bike, and I landed arm out head first, and then the bicycle landed right on the back of my head. Now, according to my friend, and mind you, we're 12 years old, 7th grade. I was lying there on the ground with my hands over my head, on my back going, The parking lot was adjacent to a tennis court. So some people that were playing tennis came over, and they're making sure I was okay. And when I I guess, came to, since I guess I was unconscious, I could hear the people talking to me, but I couldn't see them. And so they helped me pick up my bicycle. They had a Toyota type van. They put the bicycle in the van. They put me in the van. They were going to take me over to the emergency room at the base hospital, which is about 2, maybe 2.5 miles away. So to this day, I have no idea what they look like. I remember being helped into the van, driving, and as we got closer and closer to the hospital, I started getting my vision back. Okay, there's the library. I started recognizing where we were. They basically said, when we got to the emergency room, "Are you okay?" "I'm okay." And they just dropped me off, and I guess they walked me in, and inside the emergency room, Air Force Base, so some tech just did the old check the eyes and clean up the wound on my head. And, "You okay?" "Yeah, I'm okay." I'm 12. I got on my bicycle and rode back home, and that's up the drive of from the hospital to the main street, and then the 2 miles or whatever it was back to the house, because the parking lot was only a couple blocks from where I actually lived. And yeah, so by the time my mother got home, I was in the bathroom throwing up, and Sheila, what's going on? I told her, and right back to the hospital. They kept me for 2 days. So not good. But it wasn't until I had hit my head, and I'd hit the back of my head before and stuff, but that was the one I could not see. I bet you for the better part of 5 minutes, maybe longer, of just, I felt like I was looking around. I actually, what I'm doing right now, this is what I felt like. I felt like I was trying to open my eyes, but my eyes weren't open. And I bet you when they were looking at me, my eyes were open. I just couldn't see. And that's because of the impact with the back part of my brain, the cerebrum, where we see. That story I told you of the young boy who lost his eyes before he was 3 years old. It's that part of his brain that was so hungry to just keep learning that it took over for some of these hearing areas. And this part of his brain wasn't the only thing doing hearing and smelling. It was, this part of his brain started doing it too. So he could hear really exceptionally well. So that's an example of the cerebrum. Again, we call the big thick parts the gyri, and the creases are the sulci. Each gyrus as a singular, each sulcus as a singular, are basically mapped out. And if I didn't mention it on whether it was first lecture or last lecture, nobody's brain is exactly the same. We have general ideas of what the part of the brain is supposed to do, but your neuron connections are unique to your experiences in life. Even if you had an identical sibling with the same DNA, you still have different experiences, right? Even the conjoined twins that do everything together, there might be where one's looking this way and one's looking that way, and those experiences on the brain have a different effect, which means that if you were to try to map the brain and you have the ability to look at every neuron connection to another neuron, they just wouldn't connect the same. It's unique to you and your experiences as far as that goes. Let's take a look at some other cerebrums. There is at least one half. That's the left hemisphere of the cerebrum. So essentially cut down the middle and opened up, and we're looking from the medial side, or if you will, the middle of it looking in. And again, we can see those gyri and those folds called sulci. And then this is that hard body, the callus body called the corpus callosum, which bridges that left and right hemisphere of the brain. So you can see the difference in texture of the big cerebrum versus what looks like a bush, if you will, or a tree. This has been described, and you can see it out to the left as the arbor vitae, which arbor, if you know, is plants or trees, and vitae, like vital, is the Latin word for life. So it's the tree of life, is what the original observers thought that bush of the cerebellum looked like. When you look at the outside of the cerebellum, I think it looks more like, I don't know, packaged hamburger meat or something. And I'm not even hungry when I said that. So this is your brain stem right here, where it says midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. And then this thing capped on top with this little zone, that's your thalamus and hypothalamus. Just to let you know, this little dangler right here called the pituitary gland technically is not part of the brain. It's an endocrine gland. It does not really have the same brain setup. The back part of it is from the same tissue as the brain, but the front part of it, and I don't know if you can see a difference in the color when you look at it. The front part, you see how about 2/3 of it's a different color. That's from the same tissue that develops the tongue. Yeah. So as the tissue grows, it goes and it fuses with the back part of the pituitary from the brain. So it's what we describe as an endocrine gland. It secretes hormones into the bloodstream. And then this little guy back here, that's also not technically part of the brain. It's called the pineal gland. And the pineal gland, again, is an endocrine gland. It's closely associated to the back part of this region of the brain because of its function towards sleep and other biorhythms, like when we eat and those things. And it uses the same basic component as the rest of this area of the brain in serotonin, and it makes a hormone from the serotonin called melatonin. Now, there are some people, my wife included, and she's probably going to hear this when she's been watching the videos because she's trying to improve her neurology. And when she hears this, and I'm going to say it, she feeds my children, maybe not so much anymore now that they're older, but she feeds them melatonin like it's candy. And I know why. A while ago when they were younger, we'll just say from the time they were born to, when she wanted to go to bed, she made sure they had their melatonin because they were going to fall asleep. So it really was all about, making sure they were asleep so she could go to sleep. But my kids refer to melatonin as sleeping medicine. Is it truly medicine? It's technically a supplementation of the melatonin your pineal gland already makes. And so when we actually get to the endocrine system and we talk about the endocrine system, we will rehash that pineal gland and how that major hormone of melatonin is very effective for improving the quality of sleep. All right, so that's a pretty good left hemisphere. This is one of those color-coded things where they take the cerebrum and they break it down into the different lobes. Again, top view looking down like a bird's eye view, we see the left hemisphere in yellow and the right hemisphere in pink. And if you look at the brain, you see a relatively close symmetry between left and right, but there will always be a little bit of asymmetry between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. Interesting that even though the male brain is larger in mass, there's more overall surface area for the female brain. And whether or not that has something to do with chromosomal development or whether that's related to hormonal things such as the fertility cycle from the time of menses through menstruation, which basically the fertile years, we're not really sure exactly why the female brain develops more surface area, but it surely does. The left side, this picture over here, where they've got the cursor, it's basically color coding the different lobes of the cerebrum. And again, the lobes are basically named for the bones they sit underneath. So when we learn about the skull, when we learn about the cranium, which is the part of the skull that protects and houses this brain, the frontal bone is the front, coming over the top and meeting two parietal bones. And then to the back, the occiput, which also comes under the big hole of the skull, is in the occiput. And then to the sides where your ear canals are, those are your temporal bones. And so each of these lobes, again, is named for their correlating cranial bone. The only other lobe that gets described, if you pull apart the purple and the green there and look deep in there, you'll find a small little area that is referred to sometimes as the insula, which the insulated lobe, who was first described by a researcher named Ryle, R-E-I-L. So he described it as an island separated from the rest of the lobes. So it's been known in the anatomy world as the Isle of Ryle because it rhymes, I guess. But yeah, that's indeed what's going on. So there's that. There's another version that's a little more crazy, but you know, it's got a little separation here for where you're feeling your body for versus where you're moving your body. And then somebody that's a little bit more detailed as far as the color area. Again, you'll hear things like premotor and somatic sensory and all these fancy words. I don't know who Broca was, but Broca's got his name attached to a few different things. This is one. Broca's area is what neurologists look for when a person has a stroke and has trouble speaking. They're looking at that region of the brain because this is how we formulate our words. We'll comprehend it in this little zone where it says, general interpretation, right? In that. So you've got this area called Wernicke's, the speech and language comprehension area, and that transfers over. So we think what we want to say, and then we physically say it. It's the left hemisphere. Even though, again, one of the things that can happen is like a mirroring of the development of the body. And it's possible that somebody's Broca's area could be potentially in their right hemisphere, making them most likely left-handed. And it's just a mirror image of what you expect. But the majority of people would be left hemisphere. And it's much more common to see right-sided stroke symptoms because of that stroke happening on the left. So typically when there's what we call contractures and evidence of stroke on the right, they also have difficulty with speech because, again, it can affect the greater part of this area of the brain because the left cerebral artery covers pretty much most of this area. And then branches of it are what typically either hemorrhage or potentially get obstructed or blocked. That's the difference between what we call an ischemic stroke versus a hemorrhagic stroke. If a blood vessel bursts and the blood just leaks out, hemorrhagic. And when you open up the skull, like a coroner or a pathologist would, it would be full of blood. But if it's ischemic, which means due to decreased blood flow, then when pathologist looks at it, it would look bruised versus bloody. And that means that blood wasn't getting to the brain. So yeah. So I did not mention this, but I will now. There are no pain receptors inside the brain. There are no nociceptors, which means receptors that can pick up noxious signaling that typically sends pain. So I don't know if you've seen movies like, you remember Silence of the Lambs, that movie? So you had a guy named Hannibal Lecter in one of the sequels, prequels, whatever it actually was, unless it was Silence of the Lambs itself, whichever one Ray Liotta's in. And honestly, I don't remember which one. It had to be Silence of the Lambs because later on he's like, I'm having an old friend for dinner. Ray Liotta's sitting there, his scalp is removed and he's talking. And I guess Hannibal Lecter, insane like he was eating part of his brain. And so was there's no pain nerve endings. So a neurologist can do surgery and cut all on it and you won't feel any pain from it. Now you'll feel pain going through the scalp and through the bone and through the dura mater, all nerve with nociceptors, but not the brain tissue itself. So for a lot of brain surgery with these neurosurgeons who are trying to remove tumors, for example, if you're going into the brain to repair a blood vessel, there's usually very little concern because you're not removing any brain. But if they have to remove tissue because of a tumor, many times the neurosurgeon will wake up the client during surgery so that they're conscious, especially if they've got to work around speech areas or visual areas or whatnot, because they have to determine to what degree are they using that part of the brain where the mass is, where the tumor is. Because very, very little brain can be really sacrificed, but you need to remove all of this tumorous mass. So they'll wake up the patient, they'll have a psychologist like with familiar cards or symbols speaking to the patient, what is this? That's whatever's on the picture. And while they're doing that, the neurosurgeon is using small electrical signals to see if that's interrupting the talk or their ability to see or whatever it is. Because if it does, then that's a part of the brain they can't really afford to sacrifice. That's an important part of the brain that person's using. So it seems odd when people hear that since there's no pain nerve endings, you could just cut it and do all kinds of stuff to the brain. But again, there's long-term ramifications for removing pieces of brain that a person has learned to rely upon. So that's why they wake them up.
Like the cerebral or maybe even spinal.
So the blood vessels actually have nerve endings that pick up pain and things like that. So people have migraines, for example, as the blood vessels are dilating out really wide and throbbing, the person can really feel that the throbbing of the blood vessels widening. And then that leads and triggers to other noxious events that are picked up by nerve endings surrounding the brain, but the brain tissue itself doesn't have nerve endings. So not for pain anyway. There's the tracks, but it's almost like once you get out of it, then all the nerve endings are there, but not inside the brain. So, yeah. So we do consider a migraine headache, for example, a blood vessel type headache. So some approach migraines by treating the blood vessels, if you will, and others more of the palliative treatment with pain medicines, those types of things. So, the classic person with a headache is going to take some Tylenol or some Motrin, Advil, whatnot. But when they have it severe, then they've got to go into that different family, and that does really have an effect upon the blood vessels themselves. All right. So what else do we see? So a different view of the cerebrum. This is slicing it as if you cut off the front of their face and skull, and we're looking straight in at it. And again, we can see the difference between the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. These are those chambers called ventricles that are reservoirs for the cerebrospinal fluid that's going to bathe the periphery of the brain and spinal cord in that subarachnoid space of the meninges. Hopefully you remember that discussion. As you get into this zone, I don't know if you can see how there's a little bit of a bulbous zone right here. On the TV screen, I can really see it. On my computer, I have to focus a little bit more in on it. But if I were to outline it, you see there's kind of a roundedness here, a roundness here. These are referred to as the basal ganglia, and they're that relationship between the cerebrum and the thalamus. Really important for various functions. This is, by the way, that little island of insula on the inside. But the basal ganglia, if you want to talk about basal ganglia, well, let me say it more correctly. If you get into a discussion of basal ganglia, this is one of those where you really see the importance of neurotransmitters and the intercommunication of all parts of the brain. They call them the basal ganglia because they're along the base of the cerebrum, and they're clusters of neurons and myelinated tracts. So, and you can see the way they've got this little cluster, that nucleus, and then that nucleus, the nucleus, and the nuclei are all named, a few for their shape. One of them's wedged in there, so it's called the cuneiform, the cuneate nucleus. One of them's kind of long and wraps around, so it's called the caudate nucleus because it looks like a tail. And then we've got an area referred to as the globus pallidus because it's kind of pale or kind of lost the color, but very orb shaped. And to round it all off, there's a little zone called the zona compacta, where it looks like it's just pressed with little stripes, known as the black substance or substantia nigra in the Latin. And this is where the majority of dopamine for your brain is produced. So when people have a dopamine deficiency like that of Parkinson's, they're often looking directly at the substantia nigra, that part of these basal ganglia, in an effort to determine why that Parkinson's is as bad as it is. And as the substantia nigra creates this dopamine, the way the ganglia all just use that neurotransmitter for communication out through the cerebrum, it's vital to your daily functioning as far as an alert, aware person. So that's a real brain from a cadaver. Notice that we don't see any blood vessels because the dura mater and the arachnoid mater have been removed. They probably did not remove the pia mater because typically pieces of brain go with it. So that's why it's got a little shiny look to it. But we can appreciate this temporal lobe here from this frontal lobe. And, nice, full, thick gyri, condensed, close sulci. So that would be a healthy brain. If I were to give you an example of a healthy cerebrum next to an Alzheimer's brain. So Alzheimer's brain versus I like to say healthy brain, not normal brain, because I don't know. Look at the difference from the front. I don't know why I keep looking up there. Nice and full and healthy and thick, emaciated, and I mean that's just that frontal view. If we look at another version, let me get rid of this here. Oops. Yeah, let's do that. So again, these are frontal slices, and even the ventricles become huge and large. The gyri become very thin. The sulci becomes large. That's a real brain. Oh, I don't know why we're seeing all frontal views. There we go. This is a top view. Look how full each gyrus is, how close the sulci are, and then almost look at the thinning of the gyri. You notice that it's even a different color? That's because of so much loss of myelin. Yeah, so you start to see much more of a grayish color to an Alzheimer's brain as myelinated tissue disappears. But the huge thing is just how thinned the gyri become and how wide the chasms of the sulcus become. It's no wonder the person is no longer the same as they were prior to dealing with it all. The Hollywood version of Alzheimer's is all about the amnesia, right? Forgetful. Hi, how you doing? And then, oh, hi, how you doing? That's all fine and dandy because there is some, and sometimes significant memory loss, but it's typically a short-term memory loss, not necessarily long-term memory loss. In fact, a lot of people with Alzheimer's, they regress back to when they were children as far as their mental state. There's a story I heard on the radio once of this lady who goes to where her mother was being treated in a nursing home because of her Alzheimer's. And she walked in, she remembered hearing piano, and she walks up to her mother's room and her mother's not there. And the nursing staff says, yeah, she's down on the piano. And so the daughter thinks, wow, they're using music therapy, or she's learning how to play the piano. That's probably really good for her Alzheimer's. And when she gets down there, her mother's looking at her and going, I've got my recital tomorrow. And she's like, that's fantastic. And then there's that, we don't have any kind of program like that. She just sat down and started playing on the piano, and she kept saying, I've got to practice. I've got my recital tomorrow. And this is a 40-year-old some odd lady with, as far as the daughter, and her mother was in her 70s or 80s. And for her entire 40 some odd years, she'd never once heard her mother play the piano. But in this woman with Alzheimer's head, she was this 11-year-old girl who had taken piano lessons when she was that age, and she was that's the part of her brain that was functioning. So, but yet she probably didn't recognize her daughter. And if she saw her granddaughter, who would look a little bit like her daughter, she might think that's her daughter. But again, that's the memory side of this. Notice how the front of the brain, right, or the back of the brain, they all change. So that means that personality is going to change, mood's going to change, behavior is going to change. And those are much more profound versus just memory loss. when a person's mood and behavior change so much that that person's no longer anything close to what they were, it's pretty challenging. And many times the caregivers for people with Alzheimer are their adult age children who, with this role reversal, psychologically can't really handle it, right? Mom and dad used to be the authoritarian figures. Now they're the kids that have to clean up after, and they can't take care of themselves, and it creates a lot of uh, uh, conflict, if you will, between Alzheimer's person and child, again, who's maybe 60 years old themselves, taking care of their 80-year-old parent who's got Alzheimer's. So, and I've a number of times talked to people and they're just so fed up and frustrated with taking care of their parent, but it's like they can't help it. They have Alzheimer's. So that's a great example of what we expect the cerebrum to look like and what it eventually looks like. So, but you can just see the difference. It's sad. I truly, truly hope that science and medicine figure out a way in the next 10, 15 years to not only stop Alzheimer's progression, but maybe even reverse it. If that's the case, I will age gracefully. If not, I will probably end up Alzheimer's. No, I don't know. I don't know how much it runs in my family. So if we describe the cerebrum, we're always describing the cerebrum as the top portion of the brain. But the way I try to really convince people to understand how the cerebrum benefits you is that you use one word to describe all of the parts of the, not all the parts, but all of what we expect from the cerebrum. Anything that is smart or intelligent. All right. It takes intelligence to be able to see, hear, smell, taste, understand. And again, I'm not talking about like academic intelligence. I'm talking about intelligent life. All right. So insects have the ability to see things. There's an intelligence there. We can argue about how much intelligence plants have. Okay. How much of it is just straight chemistry with the sun and the carbon dioxide in the air? How much of it is a plant really knowing what's going on? For example, when I was traveling Europe, my friend Tom and I, we were at a bus or a train station, switching platforms to go wherever we were heading. And a young American girl recognized that we were American, started talking to us. And as we were on the train, what are you going to do? And she told us that she wanted to become a plant psychologist. A plant psychologist. I do not make this up. She truly believed that plants had feelings and that she could become a plant psychologist to help the plants feel better so that they would be better at, I guess, oxygen producing. I wasn't even drinking at that point of the day. And I'm telling you, I did everything to make sure I wasn't just putting her down. But I mean, it sparked me. And I just started asking questions about, so do you lie the plant down on the couch? What do you, and she, yeah. So she probably didn't take too kindly. She was just out of high school and, so like, all right, well, good luck. So I don't know how much intelligence a plant truly has, but plants can't see. They technically can't hear. They can't taste. They may have some ability to feel, right? As far as whatever that plant version of that is, but is it a true neural network where they can respond to it? Very few plants are able to respond to a stimulus. There are some that respond to stimuli. The Venus flytrap, for example, is a good example of a plant responding to a stimulus. It's got its little bowl, it traps insects, and when the insect's in there, it'll close down, and it typically uses digestive enzymes, and it's kind of an in-between of a plant and an animal. And we don't see a lot of that, at least around the United States, but in some places where the environment hasn't been too disrupted, you see that kind of evolution. But again, I don't know how much intelligence that is as far as neurological. So get into the more animal world where there's some animals that are true just reflex, sensory and motor response. And then there were some, as evolution took place, where they evolved more complicated neural systems, which included some type of hub, a brain, if you will, that was able to process this incoming information, learn from it, which allowed that particular species or that particular animal to survive longer within that environment. And the more the intelligent brain started to develop, the better the survivability. And with that said, you end up with mammals of all types that are very, very intelligent. Are all mammals, are all mammals, I was trying to say animals and mammals at the same time, are they all as capable as humans as far as the overall intelligence, thought processes, calculation, analyze? I don't even know other animals or mammals that have any form of verbal language, written language, right? We can teach mammals to respond to certain words or certain behaviors, which again is a very that's a classic trait of an intelligent brain, to be able to learn like that. So from Pavlov's dog ringing a bell to where that caused a dog to start to salivate in preparation for food, once the dog learned as a behavior that, hey, the bell means food, that smart brain and that basic brain started to work in conjunction with each other to prepare that dog for food, right? So the mood side of the dog improved because he knew it was going to eat. The digestive side got ready to eat. I mean, it's the nervous system working as a whole. The fact that we can sit here and communicate with each other and talk to each other, and you can comprehend what I'm saying, and you can see what I'm saying, you see what I'm doing as I'm talking, and I can show you PowerPoints that have words, and that's all a testament to this intelligent brain. But it doesn't have to be only intelligent because it can read, right? Or talk or comprehend. Just the ability to interpret colors or to recognize objects and shapes. It's all the smart brain. What you're seeing requires a smart brain. You take away the smart brain, how much are you going to recognize? What's the whole, why would you even need eyes if you didn't have a smart brain to interpret that incoming signal? Same thing with taste from your tongue, smelling from your nose, hearing from the ears. All of those touch receivers that are throughout your body that are picking up those signals, sending those signals to your brain so that your brain is aware of the environment around it. That's all smart brain. All right. So all five senses plus whatever you want to include as other senses, including ESP or I don't know, whatever senses you want to throw in there, smart brain. So that is how I talk about the cerebrum. It is your smart brain. It is your intellectual brain. It is your cognitive brain. Cognitive just meaning you're aware of your environment. There's a phrase we used to use in school with assessment. Is the person aware of person, place, and time? If the person knows who he or she is, where he or she is, when he or she is, then that usually means that they're within a logical state, an aware state, versus having had some kind of head trauma where they're not sure where they are or what day it is, or some other kind of dementia type response to who they are, where they are, when they are. And that person with Alzheimer's they have dementia. There are other reasons for dementia that aren't Alzheimer's, but if you have Alzheimer's, you have dementia. And that dementia is going to get worse and worse and worse because the brain's, you saw it, shrinking. So, yeah. All right. So that is the way I want you to always think about the hemispheres of the cerebrum as being the smart brain. The smart brain. So we saw this on Tuesday, but the left hemisphere is typically the analytical side, the calculating side. What people would otherwise describe you when your left brain is scientific and analytic and mathematical, whereas the right brain, oh, that's your artistic, creative. Oh, you're really good at puzzles. And look, what if the person's just outstanding at all of it? Does that mean that they're technically both hemisphere brained? The person that's so ambidextrous that it doesn't matter which hand they're using? I don't know. So the one thing I'm not going to test you on is which lobe does this or which lobe does that or I'm going to have a set of questions on the test, which is basically which part of the brain is responsible for. And if it sounds like something that requires intelligence, a smart thing, it's going to be cerebrum, or there'll be only one cerebral part as a choice. versus the cerebellum that we use for balance so you don't fall down, and that's why I call it the balance brain, or the brainstem that keeps you alive. Look, if it's something keeping you alive with your heart rate, respiratory rate, or whatnot, it has nothing to do with being smart, just keeping you alive. Look, I don't care how well you're alive. If your smart brain's not working, you're not aware of it. You're just alive. Are you living life? Probably not, but depends on how you define living. But you're being kept alive with the brainstem parts. And I'm like you, I'm just not aware of all of that governing because it happens at an automatic level. But I am aware of what comes into my smart brain because that's what cognition is. My smart brain allowing me to be aware of my surroundings. So let me mention these words, and then I'm going to show you some video so that you can see the cerebrum in action, if you will. So let me get my laser pointer on here so you can see in the room what I am looking at. So when you hear motor output, what direction are impulses traveling? Out of the brain away. So this is where the brain can send things out of the front portion of the brain out to the body to say, do the work, whether it's making muscles contract or whatnot. But then again, your ability to receive information from the back, and then as it communicates all that to the front to where you put it all together, that recognition, it affects your personality. Again, if it's muscle movement in your body, if it's movement of your mouth, if it's even things like swallowing, or there's some component of the front of the brain sending that signal out to the muscles of your body to do that. Whereas the parietal becomes more sensory side on top. And so here are some words of sensation. Proprioception, proprio as in, I think it's not proprietary. That's something totally different. But proprio as a root word, or I guess it would be a combination of prefix root. It's the ability to receive positional information. So in other words, your brain knows where its body parts are, even if you don't see it. You can feel it because your brain knows that, and I've got my hand behind my head, but I can still feel each one of my fingers. I know my hand is here. My brain, even if I don't see it, I can feel it and still get my finger to touch the tip of my nose because my body is constantly sending information to my brain about the position. That's proprioception. If I had some pain coming into my body, that would be pain receptors sending pain signaling to my brain. That's nociception, which noci is the Latin for where the word noxious came from. But there's chemoreceptors that pick up chemicals that my body comes into contact with, whether it's the nose or the mouth or the skin. There are thermoreceptors that pick up temperature. There are mechanoreceptors that pick up vibration or touch. Or we've got all different types of nerve endings that act as receivers, receptors, if you will, that are sending that signal toward the brain, and they'll go in through the thalamus, which I'll relay later. It relays the word I want to use, and then over to the backside, top side of the backside of the smart brain, except for smell. The sense of smell goes straight into the smart brain, straight into the back of into the side back of the brain. And I believe this is the result of, if you will, the predator-prey relationship. Because if you're prey and there's predator, your sense of smell may be your first indicator that there's predator nearby, which means that there's a draft of wind or something that picks up some of the scent, and you become aware of the potential threat. Before you see it, before you hear it, before you feel it, you may smell it. And so I think it's more just think of it as a straight line communication with that part of the brain without having to go through the relay process. So that's why I think smell has its own little pathway. Every other sensation, whether it's proprioception, whether it's nociception, what we call photoreception from the retina, all through the thalamus on its way to the smart brain for processing. So notice that we see language comprehension, olfaction is smell. So that means smell, auditory is sound, hearing. Again, the back of the brain is where you're seeing. So like on the test, it says the part of the brain where you see from. I'll only have one cerebral thing on there. There'll be brainstem part, there'll be cerebellum, right? But only one cerebral thing, and sight is smart. It's absolutely an intelligent thing. You've got to have a smart brain to interpret what you're seeing. Is there a relationship between the brainstem as far as governing maybe pupillary constriction or dilation as far as reflex. Absolutely, but seeing itself right on the back of that occiput. So again, the insula is still probably the least understood part of the cerebrum, but a lot more psychologists and neurologists are looking into the insula, not just for the self-awareness, but even they're starting to look at things like clinical depression, behavioral disorders, or even addictive personality disorders to see if it's actually the insula that is somewhat overly stimulated or affected by whatever's going on, leading to those potential complications. All right, so there's your book's version of the cerebrum. And brainwaves are really more of a psychology thing, so I don't really teach it nor talk about it. All right, so let's find a nice video that talks about the cerebrum so that you can see it and hear it, not just me talking about it with pictures. So we're going to search cerebrum. Excuse me, let's type that properly. Cerebrum anatomy, that'll work. And there's one I'm thinking of, not cadaver-like. Oh, I'm glad I said not cadaver-like, because I just got an email today confirming our next cadaver class, Friday, July 19th. So it'll be in between the Thursday night and Saturday class. So it'll be like a Thursday here, Friday cadaver demonstration, Saturday, Sunday, usual stuff. Yeah. And I think that's actually the day after, let's see, I said, no, that's July 11th. So it'll be the week, 8 days after the test that's I scheduled for July 11th. So I will remind you of that. I will let Tammy know. She usually puts up a sign-up sheet so that people can sign up, and I'll have all the information for you with that. But I'll remind you later. All right, this is a pretty good one. Oh, come on. Thank you.
Got some big and tall news. Your life of clothes that don't quite fit is over. Welcome to your new life of wearing clothes that do. DXL. Wear what you want.
Runes loads a complete serving of fruits, veggies, adaptogens, vitamins, minerals, super mushrooms.
In this animation, we will explain how our brain works with breathtaking images.
Thomas Schwenke is incredible.
During pregnancy, a new human being is formed in the womb. A brain develops in which the cerebrum has no folds. Soon, however, brain folds develop that enable our cerebrum to have an incredible number of neurons in a very small space. Let's take a look at the general design of our brain. The brain is generally divided into different parts. The brainstem consists of 3 parts: the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. The cerebellum is smaller than the cerebrum, but has almost as many nerve cells as the cerebrum. Like the cerebellum, the cerebrum has a left and a right hemisphere. Both hemispheres are divided into areas. The central sulcus, which appears red here, separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. There is also a temporal lobe and an occipital lobe. The insular cortex can be found under the frontal, parietal, and temporal lobes. Let us first familiarize ourselves with the outer structures of the brain. As the brain is very fragile, it is well protected by the hard skull, which consists of several bones. In addition, the brain and spinal cord are surrounded by 3 meninges. The first meninx is attached directly to the brain and is called pia mater. Blood vessels between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater supply the brain. The dura mater is very robust and forms the outermost of the three meninges. The cerebrospinal fluid, which contains more than just immune cells, can be found between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater. This cerebrospinal fluid also serves as a cushion, protecting the brain in the event of rapid movement of the skull or a blow to the head. Around 500 milliliters of cerebrospinal fluid is produced by cells in the brain per day. The cerebrospinal fluid circulates not only in the subarachnoid space, but also in cavities known as ventricles. Ventricles are commonly divided into lateral ventricles and the third and the fourth ventricles. The brain consists of nerve fibers, which can be recognized as white matter, and nerve cell bodies, which are referred to as gray matter. In principle, all nerve cells have a similar structure. Nerve cells have a cell body in which there is a cell nucleus. Nerve cells often form dendrites, which possess spines. In addition, an axon is formed, with the help of which the nerve cell can transmit an electrical signal to another cell. The two nerve cells use a synapse to transmit an electrical signal. A synapse consists of a presynaptic part, a postsynaptic part, and a small gap between the two. Although the general structure is always the same, there are numerous forms that nerve cells can take. Nerve cells are usually divided into the types shown here. In addition, many axons in the human body are surrounded by myelin, which is formed within the brain by oligodendrocytes. This allows an impulse to be transmitted even faster. The cerebral cortex consists mainly of 6 layers. For the sake of clarity, only a few cells and nerve fibers are shown here. Under certain conditions, these nerve cells can die. In this case, we are talking about diseases such as Alzheimer's. A progressive breakdown of the nerve cells causes the brain to shrink and the folding changes. Some of the most common symptoms are forgetfulness, orientation problems, and difficulties in learning new information. Certain nerve cells or areas of the brain perform different functions. The prefrontal cortex contains nerve cells that are said to be responsible for our personality, problem-solving, and self-control, among other things. Broca's area, which makes spoken and written language possible, is often located on the left side. Another important area in the frontal lobe is the motor cortex, which cooperates with the cerebellum so that we can carry out voluntary movements. With the help of the directly adjacent somatosensory cortex, which processes information from receptors on the skin, for example, we are able to generate complex movement sequences. It is important to note that the left side of the brain receives signals from the right side of the body, and the right side of the brain receives signals from the left side of the body. Inside the brain, there are also clusters of nerve cell bodies that perform very specific tasks. The thalamus is an extremely important area, which is also known as the gateway to consciousness and is part of the diencephalon. All sensory perceptions, with the exception of the sense of smell, are processed and filtered by the thalamus before they reach the cerebral cortex. For this reason, we only perceive a few of the numerous sensory stimuli. Here are just some of the many nerve fibers that send signals from our body to the thalamus, which processes them and, if necessary, transmits them to the neocortex. The brain has nerve fibers that run from one side to the other, so that both hemispheres of the brain can communicate with each other. The entirety of these nerve fibers is called corpus callosum. The thumb-sized corpus callosum is used for the exchange of information and coordination between the two hemispheres of the brain. So the left hand literally knows what the right hand is doing. Let's take a look at some other areas of the brain that are responsible for very specific tasks. One very important area is the hypothalamus, which is probably the most important control center of the autonomic nervous system. The correct setting of temperature and blood pressure is the task of this brain region. The hypothalamus also controls our thirst and hunger. The limbic system lies deep in the cerebrum and consists of the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the fornix, with the mammillary bodies at the front end. The hippocampus is responsible for memory formation. If the hippocampus is removed or destroyed, people are unable to store new memories. The amygdala is used in particular to store information about dangers.
Just to let you know, those words sound scary, right? Amygdala, hippocampus. Amygdala just means walnut because of, you can see it, that little walnut shape. Hippocampus means seahorse. Fornix is used multiple times in the body, not just in the brain. And my gut tells me it has, that's forceps, fornix. Let's look it up real quick. It's very basic as far as if it was English. And I apologize. When I put these videos on in the classroom, I learned a while ago that if I leave my microphone on, it's picking up the speaker so it disrupts the sound on the other end. So if I mute it, then sound straight heard on your end. So for the first part of the video, if you had trouble hearing, my apologies. I recognize that I forgot to hit the mute part. Let me see what fornix etymology is. And it's something very easy. Oh, the arch or the vault chamber. So like the doorway is the fornix, like the arch of the doorway. And you can see that the way it arches on there. So and he said mammillary bodies also. That just means anything that's mammillary is breast-like. So the small little breasts like bodies. So a lot of the neurology sounds complex, but if you spoke Latin, I mean, just straight up knew all Latin, it would seem relatively elementary. So let me let this finish out.
The human cerebellum is smaller than the cerebrum, but has a significantly higher cell density. Like the cerebrum, the cerebellum possesses white and gray matter. The most important nerve cells in the cerebellum are Purkinje cells, which can be regarded as the most complex neurons in the entire nervous system. With the help of its nerve cells, the cerebellum is able to transform planned movement patterns of the cerebrum into coordinated movement sequences. Without the cerebellum, harmonious movement such as walking would not be possible. Many other areas, such as the pituitary gland, which is part of the diencephalon, are just as important. The pituitary gland is responsible for our hormone regulation and thus for growth, reproduction, and metabolism. In addition to the pituitary gland in the front of the brain, there is the pineal gland, which is also known as the epiphysis cerebri. The pineal gland secretes a hormone called melatonin. Melatonin is produced in the dark and thus influences our sleep-wake cycle.
I feel like Thomas Schwanke in 11 minutes just did everything that I've been doing since we started it. And I haven't even talked about the cerebral or the cerebellum or the brainstem yet. But no, that's just it's just his ability to put together videos. I love his digestive system one. It's just fantastic. So I would not be against having his whole library of videos. They're just good. I mean, this is his, and when we talk spinal cord, I'll put that on too. So, all right. So let's go back to our PowerPoints. And again, I don't really talk much about brainwaves. So in the video, he mentioned thalamus and hypothalamus. And when they show them by themselves in 3D, the thalamus had that two-side kind of egg shape appearance, and then there was that little yellow, almost a cube that came down to the front. I probably should have just hit pause and said, this is the two, it's called the diencephalon, which again is because of the fact that there's the two components of it, thalamus and hypothalamus. The larger part, about 80% roughly of that pair, is thalamus. And he called it the gateway to consciousness, because remember, all of those sensory inputs, except for smell, are coming into the thalamus. So you can almost think of it as like this call center, where as the information comes into the call center, it knows where in the smart brain to send the signal, but not just where to send the signal, but with what priority, with what, if you will, level of importance that signal needs, such that your conscious brain, your smart brain, is able to process it with enough awareness to respond to it. So the thalamus has those very special nuclei, those clusters of neurons that, as the information comes in, knows how to send it to the proper the correct parts of the smart brain. So if you kind of reflect back on, well, this concept of evolution, then it seems logical that you had a part of a more basic brain that started to recognize these sensations. And as the brains got more and more developed, it became a pattern of, all right, it goes here, it goes here, it goes here, to now, after however many billions of years of this evolution, I think it's billions, I don't know, whatever the evolutionary nervous system is, I don't know enough about it. But my point being is that now you've got, in smarter animals, an incredible amount of relaying of information so that your smart brain is fully aware of what's going on. And that's a testament to the thalamus. And again, smell is the only sensation, olfactory is the only sensation that does not go through that thalamus relay. It just goes straight into its part of the cerebrum. And it may be because, again, you got that speed and that quicker response to the potential threat through smell. So that's why you'll always see except for smell. Everything else, though, through the thalamus. Your sight is through thalamus, your proprioception is through thalamus, your nociception is through thalamus, your temperature, all that good stuff. If it's going to the smart brain, except for smell, it's relaying through that thalamus. And then I loved how he said the hypothalamus is responsible for, he didn't say the word homeostasis. He said, how did he say it? He said that it is responsible for, I have to go back and see exactly how I said it. The way he said it was really pretty, just a very basic way of getting to the point of this is what it does. And the examples he used were temperature control, blood pressure, right? What maintains the right amount of pressure? Because if blood pressure gets too great, something's got to lower the pressure. If something gets too low, something's got to raise the pressure. If you're too hot, you got to cool off. If you're too cold, you got to warm up. If you're thirsty, you got to get more fluids. This is all the guise of the hypothalamus, able to recognize the changes to your constant, to what your body, what your brain and body want to be at a level of consistency. And when those consistencies change, those constancies, if you will, change, the hypothalamus is there to recognize it. Now, the pituitary gland sits below it so that there can be direct communication with the pituitary, and then the pituitary triggers events that get you back to balance. And then above it, you know, you've got the rest of your brain, including smart brain, so that you can do intelligent things to get you back to balanced, right? Like, for example, I said the first day, if you're cold, your smart brain is going to think of how can I warm up? But then the basic brain, more brainstem parts are gonna be like, well, let's shiver, let's do this, let's conserve. And you're doing that at an unconscious level. You can't control your shivering. I can't just go watch, I'm gonna start shivering. I'm faking it, right? So that's hypothalamus. And look at all these things that are related to that level of balancing: hunger, thirst, you know, mood, like anger or aggression, your it says hormones, but it's basically the overseer of the whole all things endocrine, which are just using the bloodstream to get endocrine chemicals sent to the cells of your body. Sexual behavior, temperature, sleep cycles, food cycles, you name it, it's hypothalamus. It's no different than if you have a thermostat, that thermostat's there to keep your room or whatever at a constant temperature. And if it's working properly, the temperature is always where you want it to be, because it'll recognize that if it's too hot, it'll kick on the AC. If it's too cold, it'll kick off until the room warms up to that level. That is, when you hear stat, as in the word static, it comes from the Latin stasis, which means stillness or constant. All right. So again, the pituitary and the pineal glands are really not nervous system, which is why they're in a different chapter of the endocrine system. So we will come back to those when we discuss the endocrine system, which has a similar overall function to the nervous system as far as communication. It just doesn't have the wiring. It doesn't have the biology, or the, if you will, the anatomy set up for that type of instruction. It has to use the bloodstream, and then the blood delivers the instruction to the cells of the body. So it's a slower delivery of information, but a more widespread delivery as well. All right, so don't get scared by the word diencephalon. If you remember the embryology that I showed you, they're just different inside the head parts, and they all end with encephalon. The prefix changes depending on where in the nervous system that's developing. And for whatever reason, instead of just getting rid of the word diencephalon and saying thalamus and hypothalamus, which are the two parts, you hear diencephalon. But again, you can see myelencephalon, metaencephalon, telencephalon, even earlier on rhombencephalon, and they'll eventually become their different brain parts. Stick with the more adult, matured parts, which are cerebrum, which is your smart brain, brainstem, which will be the basic primal brain, which we'll discuss in a moment, cerebellum, again, the balanced brain, so you don't fall down. And you saw the way it funneled from the smart brain that decides I want to move to the cerebellum going, but this I'm going to do it with some swagger.
Yeah.
And then the diencephalon are the thalamus and hypothalamus. And even though they're part of the same general structure, they have very different responsibilities. In the thalamus being that sensory relay, except smell, and the hypothalamus being your body's homeostasis, your homeostat, keeping you balanced. All right. In the video, when Thomas Schwenke, and I don't think that's his voice, I could be wrong, but it's a different narration than some of the other videos. So I don't know, honestly. But with that said, I've never met him. I just know he has good videos. When he showed the cerebellum, he said that the most complex neurons are found in the cerebellum. And he mentioned what are called Purkinje cells. If you saw a single Purkinje neuron, you probably would not go, that's a neuron. What it looks like is a cell body with so many dendrites branched out, it looks like you're looking at a lot like grass from underneath the dirt, like all this grass. And then there's a single cell body with a very short axon. It is the bushiest. I mean, I guess I could show you a picture if you really want to see it, but it creates so many connections with the way it looks that even though it's a smaller area of the brain, it's got a lot of interneuronal connection. And again, it's how we fine tune all that. Your smart brain says, I want to get it done, but your smart brain doesn't have the fine motor ability. The cerebellum gets a hold of that signal and says, but we're going to tweak it this way. We're going to conserve energy this way. We're going to make sure, and it's so good at doing it. Movement seems effortless for us, unless the cerebellum's injured, and then movement becomes clumsy and it can be very challenging to move regularly. Let me show you those Purkinje cells. Purkinje is Purkinje cells of the cerebellum. Ooh, 3D animation. Fancy. This is an actual description. You see how it looks like small. Here's the neuron cell body. Here are all those dendrites. Very, very bushy. This is what I meant by grass. See the cell bodies down at the bottom? And these are all the dendrites. It's like looking at a layer of dirt, like you're seeing the bulbs of the grass and then all that grass. And then if we looked at the other side, it's a relatively short axon on the other end. But these are the Purkinje cells in your cerebellum at the top right. Relatively short axon. They're just very, very different than your typical cerebral neurons. And so Purkinje, as a researcher, oh wow, look at the neuroglia and the other neurons associated with that Purkinje. All those dendrites, the axon to its next set. So glutamate excited mediated, oh, granular. So yeah, that's a pretty impressive thing. That's some kind of scan where they're highlighting all those Purkinje cells. Those are neurons. See what I meant about grass? So yeah. I mean, it's and then this is a relationship to the next layer of the cerebellum, and then through the funneling of axons to the middle. But again, there's so many interconnections that as long as your neurotransmitter is functioning, this part of the brain can essentially not interrupt, but the smart brain says, I want to move. And it sends a signal toward where it wants to move. And as that funnels through the parts of the cerebrum and gets into the brainstem, the cerebellum picks up the load, right? Takes the information and goes, we are going to make this happen this way, right? So the smart brain is almost like going, make it move. And then the cerebellum gets in there and says, yeah, but tweak it here, tweak it there, use this amount of energy, use this amount of intensity, let's get it. And then by the time the signal gets to the muscle, it's been so fine-tuned by the cerebellum, again, effortless. So if we were truly just talking about the cerebellum and what it does, we'd say fine motor control. Gross motor control from the smart brain, cerebrum, but fine-tuning it from the cerebellum. But what I like to say, since it requires a lot of fine-tuning to stay balanced and constantly adjust to gravity and other forces trying to knock you down, that the cerebellum is what's keeping you from falling down. And keeping you from falling down requires fine motor control in staying balanced, especially when you start balancing, let's say you're on one foot or you're on your toes or on a guide wire or on ice skates, whatever requires that kind of balance so you don't fall down, you can thank your cerebellum. So there's this type of injury to the cerebellum. It could be because of a stroke, but pretty rare. The injury is usually the result of either a misshaping of the skull, putting the wrong kind of pressure on the cerebellum, or potentially the person was born with too many blood vessels, and the blood vessels almost form a knot, and it puts them at greater risk for not just stroke, but the blood vessels actually get in the way of the development of the cerebellum. Either way, they develop what's called cerebellar ataxia. Earlier, I had my eyes closed and I was able to easily touch the tip of my nose with my finger. The person with the cerebellar issue will, as they get closer and closer to the 2 points of contact, will start getting real clumsy and will have trouble, right? They fall down a lot. They feel just overall clumsy because they're losing fine motor control. They don't have that nice, if you will, swagger is the word I mentioned earlier, that allows them to walk smoothly or stand smoothly. And especially if they change their position and their ear is saying, hey, up is that way, they get really confused and they fall. They just straight up stumble and fall. You would otherwise think the person was intoxicated, but it's not. They haven't had anything to drink. They're that way because their cerebellum's injured. It's not functioning properly. It's not allowing such fine motor control that muscle movement is effortless. So excuse me. So we do have a tendency to think of the cerebrum as your smart brain issuing the instruction, but the cerebellum is still that motor part that fine tunes it. So don't think that the cerebellum is receiving sensory information and figuring out the world. No, that's going past it all the way up to the back of the smart brain, top and back. All right, through the thalamus. Then, right. And then as you saw, as it's coming out through that cerebellum, fine tuning it, it works fantastic when it's working. All right, that is the cerebellum. And these are Purkinje cells. Crazy, crazy anatomy. And just to let you know, that's a typical picture of the cerebellum. And when you see the cerebellum, again, sliced open, if I just do cerebellum, so this would be a cerebellum by itself, left one, right one, whatever. They often have it highlighted relative to the other parts of the brain, but I like showing it all by its lonesome. Let's show you one by its lonesome. There. That's the cerebellum all by itself. Okay. So looking at it from the top, looking at it from underneath, not quite the same as all the gyri and sulci of the cerebrum, right? So they stand out. And then if you open this up, again, we saw earlier one view where it was opened up, the tree of life that way, arbor vitae. Oh, that's a cadaver one. This is cerebellum. This is brainstem. Pretty impressive dissection. If you open it up, ooh, they've removed a good portion of the cerebrum, so we can look right down on the backside into the, well, that's still cerebrum, but that's a transverse slice. Whew. There's your cerebellum relative. And if you look at this part of the brainstem, you see where it says pons, and you see how that part of the brainstem has a little similarity? That's because they develop from the same embryological tissue. So even though this is part of the basic brain and this is your balanced brain, they look a lot alike. It's almost as if the pons is hooking the cerebellum onto the back of the brainstem, which, by the way, is why it's called the pons, the bridge. There's the little tongue and lingula, the anterior lobes, the different lobes, the fissures, all the, and you know, this is people that are just really fine tuning anatomy and knowing all the little parts of the, and look, I couldn't tell you what flocculus is in English. I know it means little, but I don't know what floccula is, or nodule is node, so a little node. I'm going to go with branch maybe because of the way it's sticking out, but I don't know enough about the cerebellum to tell you, oh, that's the flocculus. Nor will I ever, because I don't care enough. But we can always look it up if need be. That's the brilliance of technology these days. We have the ability to look it up. In my day, we had to go and find encyclopedias. Now we've got the internet. Isn't that fantastic? When it works is correct. So there's your tree of life. And again, the middle part where it's white in color is tracts of myelinated neuron, and the outer cortex is all that, those layers of different neurons, including the those Purkinje cells. The next time we hear the word Purkinje, there's your flocculus. The next time we hear Purkinje will be when we're talking about the heart, because Purkinje described the outer wiring of the conduction system. So the fibers of that conduction system were described as Purkinje fibers. So pretty good anatomist is my guess. And somebody used his anatomy book to say, well, that's the Purkinje cell. All right. So the brainstem is the final part to talk about. And when it comes to basics, the brainstem is the most basic. It's the most primitive. It's the most amphibian. And the reason I say all those is because I've heard the brain called that in amphibian brain, primitive brain, basic brain, primal brain. Oh, this is on the cerebellum, sorry. Brainstem. So the brainstem, sometimes I wish it wasn't called the brainstem. It is that small trunk of the brain, if you will, not much different than a flower stem or a plant stem, you know, where the leaves or the flower come off the stem. The brain essentially looks like it's coming off the brain stem, the rest of it. But it implies that it's just kind of a stalk to hold the rest of the brain, but it's got functionality. And there are three parts to the brainstem. If you go from highest to lowest, they're known as the midbrains, pons, and the medulla oblongata. The midbrain is the right in the middle of all of it. It's the topmost part of the brainstem. The thalamus, hypothalamus, the diencephalon is capped on top of it. Simply put, the greatest amount of crossover between the brainstem and the rest of the brain occurs at the midbrain. Crossover occurs throughout the spinal cord, throughout the brainstem. So you could have things immediately go from one side to the other in the spinal cord and up, or go up the spinal cord and then into the brainstem and then over up. But there's some level of crossover, however low or high, from right to left and left to right. I have seen a few different discussions as to why there's a crossover from left to right. Not all of the discussions really make much sense to me, more conjecture or theory than anything that's solid that says, well, this is definitely the advantage of having it. If there was only one crossover, like one place, it would be a greater concern. But because there's crossover early on and later throughout, what it means is that if there is some kind of compromise, you still have the ability to get communication still to and from. And ultimately, the more avenues of pathway, the greater the communication between the body and the brain and the brain and the body. As you lose pathways, you become more and more confined to just this being the direction or the roadway, the roadmap of which the signaling can happen. And you become more limited in communication to the point where you could completely disrupt communication between the brain and the body. So it's comparable to, let's say you live within a city that has a lot of different streets, a lot of alleys, a lot of, you know, intersections, things like that. If most of those streets were closed off and you only had one or two ways to get to and from work or the grocery store or wherever, you're limited to those avenues because everything else is closed down. But if everything's wide open, you could take this route or that route, and it means that, let's say one route is under construction or closed down because of a traffic jam or whatnot, you'll just bypass it and use a different route to get to or from. That's the benefit of a truly working nervous system and even a cardiovascular system. All these different avenues of information flow for the nervous system or blood flow for the circulatory system, and it minimizes the disruption between parts. If my brain can't communicate with my body, the question is why? Is it because the central highway has just been cut off and it's got nowhere to go? Or is it because some pathway has been disrupted? And if the brain recognizes that there are other pathways, then it just bypasses that. So it's the benefit of it all. The midbrain is pretty much crossovers. The pons, which is, again, that bridge of the cerebellum to the brainstem, it almost looks like a bulge to the brainstem. I used to look at it and go, that looks like somebody threw a ping pong ball and just stuck to it. That's what I used to think. Still some relay centers, some things related to reflexes of the eye, like the lens tightening, loosening for, you know, focus and pupillary constriction, things like that. But I don't care if you remember any of that. What I want you to know is that for the most part, the really, really important function of the pons is a cluster of nuclei that is directly responsible for how much you breathe in or out. Inside the pons, you have what's called the apneustic center and the pneumotaxic center. Apneustic means without breath. Pneumotaxic means toxicity of breath. Okay. So you hear the pneumo and apneustic. So PNEU is Greek for breath. That's why you hear pneumonia. It's why you hear pneumothorax or anything, even though it's silent P, it still starts with a P. So when you put an A in front of it, apnea or apneustic, it means without breath. So people that suffer from sleep apnea, they actually stop breathing while they're sleeping. So they have to look into something that prevents them from, well, not breathing, so that they keep breathing when they're sleeping and not conscious. When you're awake, you're conscious of your breath. So you get to a point where you can decide to breathe in or out. But when you're asleep and not conscious of that, we rely on the brainstem. Well, inside the ponds, these two centers are essentially there to make sure that, one, you don't ever breathe out so much that your lungs collapse on themselves. You cannot, no matter how much you want, breathe out, breathe out, breathe out, breathe out, breathe out, and get all the air out of your lungs. Something else can force the air out of your lungs. You can't do it yourself. So this center called the apneustic center recognizes a point at which there's been enough of that exhalation, enough of that lack of inhalation, and whether you're conscious or not, it's going to force you to breathe in. If you happen to be underwater when that happens, since water is outside of your lungs and air isn't, all that water is going to come in, and now your lungs are filled with water when they need to be filled with air. Not a good thing. And especially when we get to the respiratory system, I'm going to say this repeatedly. The only thing you want in your lungs is air. You want the right humidity of the air, but you want air. No water, no sand, no chicken wing bones or whatever. Only because I inhaled one time. It never made it to my lungs, though. I'm pretty sure it just got stuck in my windpipe. But then when I coughed it up, I caught it on the end of my lips because my hands were on the chair. I was getting ready to do myself some Heimlich, self-Heimlich. Right, I had a stool in front of me. I was with some friends. I happened to be at Thurs with my brother and some friends from college. I was 21, maybe 22 at the most. And to this day, I don't know how it happened, but I had the chicken bone in my hand, and all of a sudden, it's in my windpipe. I remember standing up, looking at them. They all looked at me like, "What's going on?" I'm getting ready to like slam my chest or my abdomen onto the corner of the chair, the stool, whatever it was. And I just kind of did one of those coughs. And out the bone came, and don't ask me how, I caught it on the end of my lips. So imagine looking at me and not seeing anything but a little bit of like fear in my eyes. And then all of a sudden seeing a bone goes. And then I put down, and my brother and my buddies just started laughing hysterically. And I'm looking at them, what are you laughing at? I almost died right in front of you. And my brother said, "What? That may be true, but you just gave birth to a chicken bone." Because, I mean, I can only imagine what it looked like to watch that bone come out, and how I caught it on the end of my lips. I have no idea. And so that was the day. I mean, maybe I died that day, and this is all just me still dying and just stretching out time. I have no idea. Yeah. And again, when my wife sees this, she's gonna be like, "That doesn't surprise me." Yeah. Same weekend that they have that picture with my dog at home when they're taking the light. Okay, you know what I mean. All right. So, the other side of the ponds is if you breathe in too much. At some point, you'll breathe out, because your ponds will never let you breathe in so much that you pop your own lungs. When we go into the anatomy of the lungs, we find out that the lungs are full of tiny microscopic balloon sacs. So as you breathe air in, these balloon sacs are inflating, right? What happens to any balloon that you put too much air into? It tears, and all that depressurization causes a pop. You cannot breathe in so much that you pop your own lungs. You can try, but at some point, your ponds kicks in and you are breathing out. Because the apneustic center says you're not breathing, or you're not. So the pneumotaxic center is the one that says you're not going to get this air so toxic, or if you will. I don't. Again, taxic. It doesn't actually mean toxic. I don't know why I said toxic. Ataxia is without what? Taxic. It's the same word, whether it's ataxia or gosh darn it. This smart brain of mine, that's cerebrum, not remembering. So ataxia, and then the cerebellar ataxia, and then pneumotaxic etymology. So it comes from Greek, order. Taxis is order. So let's see, the original sense of irregularity or a disorder is ataxia. So when you say pneumotaxic, it would become a disorder of breath, maybe. Let's see if pneumotaxic is breathing. The order of which how you breathe, the regularity of how you breathe is what I'm pretty sure it's going to be. Pneumotaxic etymology. Pneumo is, yeah, so taxis is arrangement or order. So the arrangement of breathing or breath, the order of breath. So basically, if you try to breathe in so much you pop your own lungs, the pneumotaxic center says too much, you breathe out. You breathe out too much, it says you're not going to collapse your own lungs, you breathe in. So in other words, these two parts of the pons, the brain, middle part of the brainstem, is making sure you're breathing within a certain level. Never so much that you pop your own lungs, never so much that you collapse your own lungs, keeping you within a rhythm of breathing. That's pretty cool. Unless you're in a place where you don't want to breathe in, like underwater. So, you know, if you don't get enough oxygen, well, your brain's going to go, oh, I don't like that. And your brain's going to pass out anyway. So the cerebrum, just to let you know, the brain as a whole, with the cerebrum being the biggest part, exhausts about 20% of the overall oxygen of your bloodstream. Your muscles exhaust way more oxygen because the chemistry and how they use oxygen is different. So the majority of the calories and the oxygen-rich blood you have feeds your muscles. But other organs don't need nearly as much of the oxygen and the energy that your brain and your muscles need. So for as small as the brain is, or as big as the brain is, if you want to say it that way, it does exhaust a pretty good amount of oxygen, but that's an important function of how neurons work, is utilizing oxygen and sugar and water, et cetera. So, all right, the lowest part of the brainstem, called the, well, oblong is kind of an ovoid shape, like a irregular oval shape, and medulla just means marrow, which is usually the core or the pulp of any organ. So it's kind of a bulging core of the brainstem. So it goes midbrain, which is somewhat square, then this ping pong ball bulge of the pons, and then this little wide part that narrows into the rest of what leaves the skull and becomes the spinal cord. That's your medulla oblongata. The lowest part of the brainstem, but arguably the most vital to your existence, because it's responsible for cardiorespiratory activity, vasomotor activity, digestive activity, the stuff that's truly, truly keeping you alive. Heart and breathing. It doesn't tell your heart to beat, but it speeds it up or slows it down to meet demands. It works with that pons as far as keeping you within the rhythm, but it'll speed up or slow down your respiratory rate to meet demand. It'll increase or decrease digestive activity, urinary activity, reproductive. It is what, it's not saying, hey, organs, you work. It's just saying faster, slower, faster, slower, essentially monitoring the sympathetic or parasympathetic side of governing us automatically. And that's really super important. So that's why you're seeing respiratory, cardiovascular, vasomotor. I mean, digestive secretions, reflexes you have no control of, right? And when it says reflexes, it's not making the reflex happen. It's actually stopping reflexes, so that the reflex that encourages you to sneeze, you know, you're not just continuously in that mode, even though a lot of people have a tendency to, with a sneeze, maybe get 2 or 3 sneezes, right? That's, again, still part of that reflex. The brain works to stop that. Same thing with salivation or vomitus or pupillary constriction. You name the reflex, the sensory and motor out, the brain's there receiving the information about it and deciding what to do about it, but for the most part, stopping what was triggered by more of the sensory end of the spinal cord or brainstem response. All right. So that is the brain stem. And again, when you look at all of it together, oh, by the way, I do want to show you what a brainstem would look like if we only saw the brainstem. So the brainstem anatomy. I find when I put this picture up, and this includes the diencephalon, just to let you know, the blue and the, this is the backside of the, so that's thalamus and thalamus, the blue part, that's pineal gland. These are called quadrigeminal bodies, and you see how there's 4 of them. And so you've got the top little neck. They're the 2 superior colliculus, because collus is neck, so colliculus means little neck. So those are the 2 little parts. Anyway, this orange part is your midbrain. This green bulge is your pons, and then you see the kind of the narrowing, but still the bulge of the medulla oblongata. So that's thalamus. If we spun it around to the front, we don't see much of the hypothalamus because they've got the optic nerve, and it looks like they removed some. We can see the mammillary bodies, little breast bodies to the front. These are the optic nerves coming together. They're the only pair of nerves that come together and connect. The left one and the right one connect, and then they go to the eyeballs. That goes to the left eyeball, that goes to the right eyeball. But so we're not really seeing much of the hypothalamus in this picture. But I mean, if you saw that by itself, would you first and foremost think, oh, that's brain? That's a brain. And I'll show you some more versions of it. Oh, there's your brain. There's your thalamus. There's your hypothalamus. There's the backside. Oh, sorry, that's front side. This is backside over here. Can you see that long tail of the optic nerve traveling into the thalamus? So that's pretty nice. This is the front of the pons. This is the side back of the pons. The cerebellum would come off here. By the way, peduncle just means little foot. Peduncle. The little feet connecting the pons to the cerebellum. So with that said, I mean, all of this is just Latin. The cross of the cerebrum, or the cross is the foot, or the leg, excuse me, the leg of the cerebrum to the, it's almost like the little cerebral feet, legs that come down. So that part is hypothalamus. That's pituitary gland. See what I meant about the back part being like the nerve stuff, and then the front part like it's strapped to it, because that develops from the same stuff as the tongue. Hypothalamus, thalamus, midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. This is called the olivary nucleus. See how it says the olive? Because it looks like an olive's on there. This bundle is called the thin bundle. Gracilis meaning thin or skinny, and fasciculus just meaning little bundle. So that's the wedge bundle. And those are different parts of the medulla oblongata that once it's through the skull, see where it turns yellow? That's outside the skull. That's spinal cord. This is inside the skull. That's medulla oblongata. There is no physical separation between the medulla oblongata and the spinal cord. It's just where is it relative to the skull. Inside the skull, brain part, medulla oblongata. Outside the skull in the spinal canal, spinal cord. But you can see it's continuing. The fascicles, the little bundles are still the same. All right. So again, I typically don't think that people would look at the brainstem by itself and think, oh, that's part of the brain. But here they've got it: medulla oblongata, pons, midbrain, hypothalamus, thalamus, the upper arch, the separator, the pellucidum is so if it's pellucid, it means it's see-through. So the clear septum, and then the hard body of the corpus callosum. Cerebellum, brainstem, and then some things along the backside, and the little necks of the backside of the brainstem. So, and then it's always nice when you have it color coded, and you can see the oval shape of the thalamus. You can see the position of the midbrain relative to the pons, the different, if you will, bundles of the medulla oblongata. But then again, why is it called spinal cord here? Because the skull would be right there, and that would be the hole that it exits through. So yeah, there's a model of the brainstem all by itself with the spinal cord would be right there. That's a front view. So yeah, when you see the brainstem, you often see that thalamus and hypothalamus capped on. But if you remove the diencephalon, you wouldn't have. Oh wow, they make that look like this little fetus up there. It would just be this part, and this part. 3 parts to the brainstem: midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. Technically, the diencephalon is capped on top. But when we talk about the overall functionality, though we can say the relay center for the thalamus, and we could say homeostasis for the hypothalamus, we're still talking about stuff that keeps you alive. Okay. Not the analysis processing of smart brain stuff, not the fine tuning of motor control, but the very primitive, basic, keep you alive type of stuff. All right. So some brain anatomy right there. They remove this part off the thalamus so you can see the lateral portion with those basal nuclei that we were talking about earlier, where we find dopamine and all that other stuff in the globus pallidus and the hippocampus and the fornix. All right. Let's talk spinal cord. You know, we could, if I really wanted to, like this brain, I could do a whole 2-hour lecture, if you will, a whole class on just the spinal cord. But is it really necessary to spend that much time on the spinal cord? You know, if this was a neuroanatomy class, maybe. But simplifying the spinal cord relative to simplifying the brain is way easier. Just simplify the spinal cord. And if you simplify spinal cord function, it is simply a superhighway system of information relaying back and forth information between brain and body. It allows, again, all of those avenues of opportunity for the different routes for the information flow between brain and body. The analogy I like to use, and this is where having a East Coast, West Coast country doesn't really help us out, but yeah, we can still do it. I guess I could, if I used a country like Italy, that's more north-south rather than the United States. United States analogy would be, imagine from Washington, D.C. to Los Angeles, which are pretty close to, you know, as far as north-south goes, but one's West Coast, one's East Coast. Imagine a 50-lane highway that went from Washington, D.C. to Los Angeles, right? 25 lanes on each side. I bet you from outer space, you could probably see that. And imagine every other highway just went north and south, that no matter where you were going, you were going to go to the highway and then to and from. Whether it's from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C., Washington, D.C. to Los Angeles, or anywhere in between, that would be the central highway. It'd be the yellow brick road, if you will. Everything goes to and from that. If it's Italy, we'd be going north-south, and everything, the other highways, if you will, the other roadways would be going east and west to get into the central highway. That's an analogy for the spinal cord. It is your body's central highway system, allowing everything to be coming in left and right. Again, there's a crossover of pathway, but it's still why we're symmetrically left and right, because the central highway runs down the middle vertically. And any other nerve, whether it's the central highway system of what begins in the brainstem or continues through the spinal cord, everything's coming into and out of the brainstem spinal cord. Nothing's just going straight into the cerebrum. I mean, even the sense of smell still goes through the brainstem. It just goes through the thalamus it just goes into the brainstem and over to smell. It doesn't need to go thalamus and then be relayed back and out. So when we look at what we call the cranial nerves, for example, we'll see them connected to the brainstem. And when we look at the spinal nerves, we'll see them attached to the spinal cord. And it turns out that there are 12 pairs of nerves connected to the brainstem and another 31 pairs of nerves connected to the spinal cord. And so we can define each section of the spinal cord, since that's what we're talking about, by where those spinal nerves connect. It looks like this. You see how there's let me get my laser pointer on there. There's a nerve right here that splits to the spinal cord, a nerve right here that splits to the spinal cord. We would call this one segment of the spinal cord. There's 31 of those. Yeah. So if you look at this picture, this is your spinal cord, right? And as it runs down and down and down and down and down and down, it ends right about there. There's still nerve in the canal, but that's the horse's tail, equina, horse, cauda, tail, the tail of the horse. That's technically not spinal cord anymore. So the spinal cord ends right here, somewhere between the vertebral segments of lumbar 1 and 2. If you're looking at the skeleton in the room, that's a pretty bad skeleton right there. I mean, if that's not scoliosis, if you're not in the room, you don't know what I'm talking about, but that's a very flexible model that we have of a skeleton, and somebody bent it pretty good. Maybe they were doing some massage of scoliosis. I don't know. Either way, the low back vertebrae of the spinal column, there are 5 big ones. They're the weight bearing ones. There are no ribs connected to them. All right. So yeah. Oh yeah, we can do that. That one's pretty bent also though, isn't it? Yeah, this one's losing its luster. This thing's older than I am. Not really. My father gave this to me and he used it in chiropractic school and I've used it and it's been just worn out over time. But when you're looking at the vertebral column, these 5 vertebrae are called the lumbar vertebrae. They're the weight bearing vertebrae, no ribs connected to them. And if you were to look behind it, you see these spinal nerves exiting. They're connected to the spinal cord, but not here. They have to travel up into where the cord ends because the cord technically ends. If this is 5 and this is 4 and this is 3 and 2 and 1, the cord is technically ending somewhere where my finger is. It comes to an end between the L1 and L2 vertebrae. And so we describe it as coning off. It comes wide and then it just cones off. And the very tip of it is referred to as the conus medullaris. The same medullary word as we saw with medulla oblongata, but now it's the medullary cone, the core or pulp of the cone. So if you were to slice that like a banana being sliced into 31 segments, that's the spinal cord. And then each slice would have a nerve pair on each side connected to it. Now, when you look at the nerve root splits so that the sensory neurons can run through the backside and come into the back of the spinal cord to go up the back of the spinal cord to the back of the brain. And then the motor instruction comes out the front side, out of the front of the nerve to go out to the body. So there is a split in the root, but this is essentially one segment. Now, what's important to understand is when you're slicing the banana of the spinal cord into its 31 segments, they're not all equal height. As you get closer and closer to the cone, the segments start shrinking, which means the nerve connection's not as great. And as those nerves come out, initially they're a little bit smaller, but as they join up to form their bigger nerves again, they become really big. But the roots are relatively small. They're biggest at the base of the neck where nerves are getting ready to run to the hands. And then even though the segments get smaller, the spinal cord starts to bulge as those nerves connect to it, as they're going to become the nerves that run to the lower half of your especially your lower extremity. So let me explain those 31 pairs. When you look here at and this isn't the greatest picture of a spinal cord, but you see how there's nerves coming out, nerve coming out, nerve coming out, nerve coming out, nerve coming out, right? Those are what we would call the nerve roots, the spinal nerve roots, the spinal nerve connecting to the spinal cord. Again, if we zoom in, we'd see that the roots split anterior or ventral, if you will, and posterior, which is described as the dorsal root. So the bulge is the dorsal root. It's always the backside where the dorsal root is. And those are, again, sensory neurons bringing sensation into the back of the cord. The front is the ventral root or the anterior root bringing motor out. Now, with that said, if I were to show you a picture of a spinal cord like this, spinal cord anatomy. All right. If I show you just this, again, you're looking at one segment. See how there's a nerve here and a nerve there? And it's showing you the different tracks of nuclei, within the gray matter where it's interneuron cell bodies, not myelinated. That's why it's dark like that. But all this periphery, those are all the myelin tracks. If I show you this version, now we see the spinal cord in the spinal canal, and it's sectioned into its 31 different segments. The neck part has 8 segments. The body part, if you will, the trunk part has 12 segments. The low back has 5 segments. Even lower, what's called the sacral region has 5 segments, and then the coccyx has a segment. But I want to point something out. The front here is showing you the bones of the vertebral column. Okay. And there's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 vertebrae that make up your neck. but there are 8 red spinal cord segments. All mammals only have 7 cervical vertebrae. Every single mammal. Probably a lot of other animals too, but I don't know enough about other animals other than mammals. I just know every mammal has 7 cervical vertebrae. But our spinal segments, there are 8 relative to the neck. I'll explain that in a moment. The thoracic region, which means the trunk region, is defined by the ribs connecting to the vertebrae. These 12 purple bones each have a pair of ribs connected to them. And like the rib pair, there are 12 spinal cord segments. The 5 lumbar vertebrae are big, and there are 5 lumbar segments. The sacrum, which is the bone that the spinal column sits upon that connects to the 2 pelvic bones, initially is 5 individual segments, but before you're born, they fuse into one bone. So it's technically one bone, but it still has segments, and each segment has little holes where the spinal nerves are coming out. And then there's a coccyx, which is technically 4 fused segments into one. It's just one pair of nerve exiting there. Now, what I'm trying to point out is the fact that even though the sacrum's way down here and the spinal cord ends way up there, that little blue section, if we were to put it level to L1 and L2, where the spinal cord ends, see where I told you it ends between L1 and L2? But look at all these nerves traveling down and out the sacrum. Because we number every segment of the spinal cord, not by where it is level to the vertebrae, but where the nerve pair that connects to it actually exits from the spine. So because these segments down here, even though the spinal cord ends at L1 and 2, because the continuation of the horse's tail has a segment that ends, say, here at S2, if we were to follow that nerve all the way up, where it connects to that part of the spinal cord, that little section would be the S2 segment. So we number the spinal cord segments not where it is level to the bone, but where its spinal nerve pair exits. And for the lower part, all that, which is the horse's tail, those nerves actually run down and then out, down and then out. Whereas in the neck, they pretty much run straight out. Now, the reason why the numbering is off from the vertebrae in the neck, where it's the same with everything else, is because the anatomists who initially described this stuff, instead of just being logical and describing this very first as the suboccipital segment, which means below the occiput, where it's coming out under the occiput above the first vertebra, they actually call that first one, oh, that's the first cervical segment. So what happens is in the neck, the segments have nerves that exit above the bone until the 7th bone, where the 7th one exits above, but the 8th one of the group exits below, and then everywhere else it's exiting below, 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 below. That is never going to come back to haunt you, except for the very last question on the test, which asks what the name of the segment is that's exiting below C7. It's not T1 like the bone, it's actually C8. Now, if they were to name them properly, like I think they should have logically, then the first segment would be the suboccipital segment with its segment exiting below the occiput, and every nerve segment would have its spinal nerve exiting below the actual vertebrae all the way down the spine. So if and when, which will never happen, I write my own book that becomes the academic standard for anatomy, won't ever happen. But if that does happen, I'm renumbering this system. All right. So let me ask you this. If you look at this picture right here, how many segments do you see on this spinal cord? And the answer, not this left one, not this, just this one right here. And the answer should only be 2, because there's a spinal nerve pair and there's a spinal nerve pair. This is a segment and that's a segment. So look, they've got this segment numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, all cervical. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, all thoracic. Then look how small they're starting to get. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the lumbar. And then look, the segments are so small they can't even put the numbers on there. But 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sacral and 1 coccygeal. This is the dura mater right here with the horse's tail that would be in it. This is the end of the spinal cord, right? Notice that dura mater stays the canal, but the pia mater only hugs the tip of the spinal cord. All the rest is subarachnoid space full of cerebral spinal fluid. So that's the spinal column, not the spinal cord. So on this one, there's a nerve pair, there's a nerve pair, there's a nerve pair. That's 3 segments of the spinal cord. Here's an entire spinal cord with the horse's tail from the point of the occiput, which is really the frame and magnum, the hole, it means the great hole. The great hole of the occiput, the skull bone, is where the spinal cord officially starts, and it ends somewhere between L1 and 2. By the way, it's further down when you're a kid, but as you grow tall, the spinal cord is done lengthening. So you start growing taller, and the spinal cord gets closer and closer to L1 as far as the end. But it's part of the reason why an epidural, they'll have the person bend over and they feel for those first set of lumbar vertebrae, and they go right underneath L1, between L1 and 2, to put that long needle in there. Never gonna have, I mean, never had an epidural, hopefully never gonna have one. And for those of you that have been the fortunate recipients of epidurals, I say fortunate because it probably made for less pain with delivery. At least when my wife had an epidural, she was much more pleasurable as far as delivering babies. I said it. Anyway. In order to see a spinal cord truly like this, we have to do a procedure called a laminectomy on the cadavers. We have to actually cut through the bone of the backside of the vertebral column and remove the whole backside of bone so that it opens up the canal. Then we have to cut through the dura mater and open up the dura mater to be able to see the spinal cord like this. We're looking at arachnoid mater because you can see all the blood vessels. So again, this is the cervical section, thoracic section, lumbar section in green, that little blue sacral section, that very tiny purple coccygeal segment, but it's in total 31 segments. And each segment is always defined by the pair of spinal nerves connected to it. So you can see how it enlarges in the cervical region, gets real thin in the thoracic region, enlarges again in the lumbar region, into sacral and coccygeal, right? So thoracic's getting bigger, lumbar's green, sacral's blue, and then that's all horse's tail, cauda equina. And if you notice something about the horse's tail, the one that's on the outside here exits there, then the next one on the outside exits, and the next one's on the outside. So the more lateral it is as it's narrowing, the more it exits. You ever been to an air show where you watch like the 5 airplanes come in and then they go up like this, and then the outer 2 go out, and then the one in the middle is just going straight up? Fortunately, they're going up, not all coming down. Well, the horse's tail comes down. The outer ones go out, then the next ones go out, and the next one, and just that very last one down the middle, which is coccygeal, to the very end. So that's segmenting the spinal cord into 31 pairs. Sorry, 31 segments due to the 31 pairs of spinal nerves numbered where they actually exit the spinal column, not where they connect to the spinal cord. All right. So you have this big central highway of information traveling in the spinal canal, 8 cervical segments numbered above the vertebrae until C8, and then everything is exiting below. But like the vertebrae, then 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, 1 coccygeal, and they form their, again, those are the sections, 31 total segments defined by the paraspinal nerves. That has 3 segments. 1, 2, 3 again. And again, dura mater and arachnoid mater and pia mater in the canal. Blood vessels, very important for supplying. That's one slice of the spinal cord, the gray matter of interneurons, the white columns on the dorsal side, the ventral side, the different tracks going up and along the back. They're ascending if they're yellow. All right, they're coming down green. I don't know much about these descending tracks over here, but these are really the down and out. Down and out. All right, that's a great little set of pictures. One segment there, relative to the back of the vertebral column, the different regions or sections, the individual segments, and then the way it goes to the skin. All right, everybody, that then takes us to our end point of our central nervous system. All right. When I see you on Saturday, I'm going to introduce to you the peripheral nervous system, and we'll actually follow those cranial nerves out of the brainstem and follow those spinal nerves out of the spinal cord and see where they go and how they become named, most of them along the bones they run, and how they end up branching out to groups of muscles or skin or whatnot, so that we can determine how the connection allows intercommunication between the brain and that part of the body. All right. So I will most likely review the spinal cord part by showing you Thomas Schwenke's video that include the spinal cord, which also has a little bit of review of the basics of the nervous system. But that's the game plan for Saturday at 3 p.m. Have a wonderful night. Look for this recording. Again, I probably won't have my computer on tonight, so I see patients starting at 1 tomorrow. That's probably when I'll open my computer and then send out this information. Okay. Have a great night, everybody. See ya.